This week's hints and tips video won't relate directly to the functionality you're being asked to produce for assignment 5, but instead will help those of you who have errors or issues or problems or logical problems with your code. We'll try and help you solve those problems by looking at how we can solve similar issues in a similar piece of code. So the reason for this is many of the assignments I've seen this week have been logically really good. The quality has been very high. But the issues that I have been seeing are people who have different or subtle or tough errors that they can't quite work out. So I think this is a really good thing for this tips video to focus on. Also, given that it's arriving just a couple of days before the deadline, it really will suit those people who have finished all their code and are just trying to iron out those small problems. So as always, I'm going to look at an example. This is going to be an example that can be related conceptually to the assignment. But this week, rather than writing it from scratch and having you watch it as I do that, I'm going to look at something that I've already written. And what I've already written has got some issues in it, and we're going to try and work out and iron out those issues. The first class that I'm going to use in this example is something we've seen already, a class we've seen before. This is the pair class. So remember, the pair class allows me to store or relate two values together. Part of the whole point of object orientation is that we can use classes to relate primitive values or maybe even existing class type values together. So here we're simply relating two integers to represent that these are a pairing, and nothing unfamiliar here hopefully. So two private integer fields, a constructor that allows me to set the values in those fields when I create objects of this class, two setters, two mutators to set the value in A and set the value in B, and two getters, two accessors that allow me to get whatever values back that are stored in these fields. Now I've implemented another class called pair balancer, and the idea here is in kind of a programmatic as opposed to mathematical way. I want to bring any values that are in a pair together. So if I have a pair where there's 0 in the first field and 10 in the second, so value A is 0 and value B is 10. Actually, I can show you the driver. This will help you. So I've got this pair balancer, and I want to be able to create a pair with 0 in the first value, 10 in the second. And what I want to do is kind of programmatically rather than mathematically, I want to bring those values up and down simultaneously so that they meet in the middle. So I find the halfway point between them and change the values in the pair like this. Okay, so what I'd want to do here, for example, is I'd want to balance them so they become the same value by moving the first value up and the second value down. So this would obviously become 5 and 5, wouldn't it? As 0 goes up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it goes 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. And as soon as they're the same, as soon as they're balanced in this way, I'm going to stop and I want to finish. So this is the functionality that I want. This is the functionality that I'm looking for. Not really, I don't know, perhaps not particularly useful. I always try and provide you with the most practical examples that I can, but sometimes they have to be a little contrived. Yeah, this is what we're looking for. So I've built this pair balancer class. What it's gonna do is it's got this pair field, which is the one that it wants to balance. Actually, let's call this to balance rather than to increment. Oh goodness, yeah. I think that makes a bit more sense. Let's call this to balance, because it will increment it, but I think to balance is better. So a little name change there. Always remember to try and have these relevant variable names. There's lesson number 1. In fact, that could be our first error, couldn't it? Our first logical error is our field, the name of the field didn't quite match the functionality that we're trying to do. There we go. That was obviously completely planned. Error number 1, logical error number 1. Good field names. Excellent, good. So the functionality here is we have another constructor. It takes the value for that I want to store in the pair in A and the value that I want to store in the pair in B. I have this pair field. What I'm doing is as I'm given these A and B values, I'm going to set the value in these pair fields in the first in value A of the pair field here to be whatever's passed in value A. So I call the method on this field value A to set the value A, the first value. And then the same process for value B, I call that, and then I call this to balance field. Yeah. And then I have this balance pair idea, which is supposed to achieve this functionality that I want. So while it's the case that A and B are not the same. I want to change these values. I want to change the value in A, and I want to change the value in B, such that eventually they're the same, which means that this while loop will only keep going while A and B are not the same. So it'll keep changing A, keep changing B, keep incrementing one, keep decrementing one, and until they're the same, and then it will finish. And then again, back to my driver, so I want to do this twice. So I want one balancer with one pair and then another balancer with another pair, just to kind of test things out, just to make sure things are working. So this is the program that I have, and there are some problems here. So we ironed out the first one, which was a nice coincidence there, in the fact that I was able to provide a more descriptive field name. That was my first nice logical error there, or logical issue, I should say. But there are some more, and importantly, this program compiles, right? So if you're typing this out, which I would recommend, then you can compile it and it'll all be fine. And this is obviously where the most difficult errors arise, because when the errors get caught by the compiler, when they're these syntax errors, they're really easy to spot because you get the actual line number that's the problem, right? And we're going to talk about error checking hopefully towards the end of the course in a bit more detail, but it's when you can compile your code and it compiles fine, but then it runs in a strange way, or you get these strange errors when you run your program, that things get a bit more complicated. So this is something we touched on briefly during this week's lecture, when we looked at the fact that if you enter a string when a scanner is expecting an integer, it will compile obviously because the string doesn't arrive until runtime, but you will then get this error that will be thrown during the running of your program. So again, things get more difficult to work out when your program compiles, but it just runs in a strange way. This idea of logical or runtime errors, or logical errors that cause runtime errors, as opposed to syntax errors. Okay. So let's look at what we can do here. So obviously the first thing to do is to run this program now, right? So it compiles fine. Again, I would encourage you not to use IDEs, but I am just for ease and for clarity. So here I can see I've got no red lines underneath anything, which means that this all compiles fine. So I can go ahead, I can run my driver and see what happens, right? So I can run this and look, I've got an error. Yeah? And this is an error I've seen a couple of people come across. It's one that I just chatted about on the forum, but I wanted to show you again in more detail what the problem is here. So it says exception in thread main. Hopefully you can read this. I made it a little bigger for this video. And it says at pair balance, pair balancer Java 8. Okay, so perhaps slightly less descriptive than a syntax error, but fortunately we still have enough expressivity here with this notion of an exception, which is again something we'll talk about later in the course. We still have enough expressivity here to see that where this issue arises. And I'm told that the issue arises in the pair balancer class on line 8. Okay, so line 8 of my pair balancer class, there's some problem. All right, and again, it might be quite hard because there's no error message here. It just says null pointer exception. There's not really much we can derive from that if we don't actually know about the null pointer exception. You could, and again, this is a nice point to make. You can see java.lang.nullPointer exception. This kind of suggests. Remember, we saw something quite similar. We saw java.util.scanner. This does suggest that maybe this is some kind of class, and it actually is a class. So as we'll see later on in the course, errors themselves can at times be classes. It's quite a nice conceptualization there. So you could go on the API, look up this null pointer exception, have a read about what it does. But again, we're not given the way that we've kind of shown you how to program. You shouldn't really be running into these issues if you kind of follow verbatim what we've been told. So there's no real expectation that you will run into these, but you just might do by accident. If we were expecting you to run into them, of course, we would have looked at them in detail during the course. But just to give you kind of an overview, if something is a null pointer, if you get a null pointer exception, it typically means that something's empty. Typically means that you're trying to access something that isn't there. That's what we think about when we see this null pointer exception. So let's think about it to ourselves. What isn't here? What isn't here in my pair balancer? What isn't here in my driver? What's missing? Well, here you can see I'm trying to call the method setValueA, which I know is a method of the pair class. And more importantly, I know it's not a static method. So that means at some point, if I want to call set value A, which I have done in my pair balancer, that means I'm going to need a pair object. But nowhere in my program have I made a pair object. Don't be fooled into thinking that just because I've written pair and toBalance here on a field, don't be fooled into thinking that there is an object in there. There isn't. Remember that before we write the new command, when we're declaring, when we're making a copy of a class, before we write the new command and then use the equal sign to assign the copy that we create via that new command to a variable, and thus we imagine at the moment, under our current understanding, that it becomes an object, before any of that process happens, this is still just an empty variable. It's just like having an int here, empty. Well, this would obviously have a default value. But here you can see it's just an empty place. Okay, so actually that's a good point to raise. So if this was an int, obviously there would be something in there because it has a default value. But if this is a class type instead, then it kind of makes sense that there wouldn't be anything in there because we've not yet assigned an object to it. In fact, there is something in there. It's this kind of notion of null, but I won't touch on that in too much depth. Okay, so the point here is that this field is empty, so should hopefully be intuitive. Again, just taking that one step further in your understanding, then there would be nothing in this field unless I explicitly assign there to be an object in there. So unlike having an int here, where I would have this default value, here instead, if I just put this class type, it's not an object, it's just an empty place for a variable, which in the future, again under our current understanding, will become an object. So it's very similar to this idea. Again, I can just put this little thing here, not related to this functionality. Kind of what I was trying to express before. If I have my int x here, and I try and do something like system.out.println x like this, remember we saw this in topic 2, x is not initialized here, right? I get this error that x might not have a value in it. So if I try and print x out, I'm going to get this error because x would be empty. Okay, so it's kind of what I was trying to say before with the int here, except of course integer fields have default values. toBalance here is empty, there's no object in there. So to actually try and call a method on an empty variable doesn't make sense. So somewhere I need to add a pair to here, a pair object to this field. So there are lots of different ways to do this, lots and lots of different ways to do this. So again, let me just say, if you get this null pointer exception, think carefully, especially at this stage in the course where really the only cause of this is going to be a lack of objects. Think about, where have I used the new command? Have I passed an object in properly to where I want to be? Is this going to work in the right way? So a simple way to solve this might be to say toBalance equals new pair, right? Because I've seen some people tempted to solve maybe an issue like this by putting equals new pair there. That's not good, of course. We don't want to be doing any assignment outside of the constructor or outside of other methods. We always want to be doing it inside the constructor. So here I could say toBalance equals new pair. And now, of course, because if you look at the constructor of my pair, it's expecting 2 values. But given that I don't add the 2 values until later on, I could do something like add 0, 0 like this. Or even more, to give me even more flexibility, I could in fact just add a default constructor here. And I want to make a point about these default constructors. So if you're ever in any doubt that you have done a non-standard constructor, so if we ask for an explicit constructor, then go ahead. There's no need to put a default one. In fact, you might want to leave the default constructor out because it might be part of the requirements of the assignment that the only way in which you can construct an object of a class is by supplying certain values. So again, if an assignment tells you that I want to be able to supply these values to an object of a class when that object is created, then I would avoid using the default constructor. But if you're ever unsure and if you ever want to add extra things, extra items into a constructor, make a second constructor. Or again, if you're unsure, add this default constructor. Okay, so I could just say public pair, which would allow me to have this now flexibility, because remember, the constructor tells us the values that need to be passed when I make objects of this class. So if there are no values, then I can make objects in any way. Yeah. So this is nice here because it gives me a bit of flexibility. I don't need to do anything awkward like supply default values to my pair because I'm about to set those values here, right? So if I add this empty constructor, it gives me this nice bit of flexibility there. So this is one way to solve this issue. But remember, we've not yet talked really about the implications of making objects inside classes that are non-driving classes. Our rule so far, our rule of thumb is to retain maximum reusability and flexibility, is to make all of our objects in the main method. So there are circumstances, and this is actually one of them, where it would be fine to make objects inside a non-driving class. This would be fine, not something you necessarily penalize, but just so we stick, again, remember these assignments, we're not looking for the most elegant solution, we're looking for a solution that matches where we currently are in the course. We would love to always try and elicit the most elegant solutions from you, but if we did that, then we'd have to expect really complex things from you from day one. So remember, we're not always looking for the most elegant solution, we're looking for the one that matches where we currently are in the course. So part of this is it would be okay to put new pair in here. So there is a risk that if you go for the most elegant solutions, you end up doing something that will deviate significantly from what we want. But making objects inside non-driving classes isn't one of those things. This is okay if you wanted to do that. But again, just to strictly stick to where we are in the course, I'm not going to do this. Instead, I'm going to think about the idea of always passing values to objects to classes from the driving class. But before I change this around, let me just show you that would now be working. So I can run that, and on the face of it, everything looks fine. It actually isn't fine because there's another error, but we'll look at that in a second. Right, so let's have a look at this. Let's take this out. And remember, now what I want to do is I want to make all my objects in the driver class, which means that I'm going to need a new pair somewhere, but I want to do this inside my driver. Yeah, so I'm going to say pair to balance, something like this, equals new pair. This time I'm going to use that nice non-default constructor, the one that actually accepts two values, and I'm going to pass this. And what I want to do is pass it straight to pair balancer. So obviously this will necessitate some change here. So I don't want instead two separate integers. I actually want a pair which I can call to balance. Yeah, like that. And then inside here, rather than passing 0 and 10, I just pass to balance. And then the same down here, I pass to balance again. Yeah. And then here, of course, again, I wouldn't need to set values because I've already done this inside my driver. Instead, I just say this dot to balance equals to balance, like this. So let's now look for, let's now actually see what our program's doing. See where, because I told you before that there was some other logical errors hidden in here. Let's see what's going on. Let's see what other problems there are here. So to do this, I'm going to actually switch to the console because I think it's best to see that here. So I'm going to bring in my little console here, which is the way that you guys would be compiling things. And I'm going to now go ahead and I'm going to compile my driver class like this, and I'm going to run it. And we're going to see something a little strange, right? So I run it, and it stops. It waits, and it kind of ends. But it has that little stopping. It has a little stopping time there, right? So I stop it. I run it again. It stops. I can enter stuff in, and it just ends. See what I mean? So it's a bit strange. So some of you might have seen this already. You kind of run your program. It stops. And looks like it's waiting for user input, which we saw in the lecture on Thursday, and then just ends. So it looks like it's waiting for user input and then ends, or maybe it doesn't end at all. Maybe it just waits. Maybe it stops forever. Okay, so there's something strange going on here, right? So if your program stops, doesn't print stuff out, doesn't reach lines. So for example, say you had a print statement later on in your code, then you can reasonably assume, not if you've not done any user input, that what's actually happening here is you're stuck in a loop. So if you have some print statements later on in your program, and you run your program, there's no user input, and you get this kind of behavior where it stops. See what I mean? And kind of maybe ends, maybe continues. Yeah, so it stops and looks like it's waiting for user input. Then what's actually happening here is an infinite loop, or a loop that's stopping your program from running. Okay, so that's usually indicative that there's something wrong with one of your loops. So the idea here now is to try and look at your code and try and critically analyze where these issues are happening, what's going on here. And by far the best way to do this, better than actually getting someone else to help you out with this, is to, and for your learning as a programmer at least, is to go to your code. And as I recommended in the debugging slides that I sent around yesterday, is to actually add print statements into your code to work out exactly what's going on. So part of how you'll have identified the issue in the first place would be with print statements, right? Because let's imagine that you were doing your coursework 5 and you had your first set of flight, or your first flight. You would have maybe printed the start destination and the end destination, and then you would have run your code and you would have had expected more print statements after that, wouldn't you? So you'd have expected print statements relating to the second, third and fourth flights, but they would never have arrived. And that would have showed you that your program was hanging, was pausing in some loop somewhere and never finishing. Okay, so don't be scared by this error. This is a loop that's not finishing, that's not completing. This is a common error that you should try and fix. And here the print statements that you've added into your coursework 5 have already shown you that there's a problem because you're not reaching some of these statements, right? So we should capitalize on this idea, and we should add as many print statements into our program as we can to understand the behavior that's going on, right? We should add excessive print statements really to understand. Okay, so even as much as this, we should say system.out.println starting in main. Yeah, you should be as descriptive as possible, print out all the values that you possibly can, and just to show yourself exactly what's going on in your program. Yeah, perfectly fine to do this, and this is actually a brilliant way to debug and to learn how your code is working. Yeah, so we could say created pair, something like this, values in pair. Okay, we could say toBalance.getValueA. We could say toBalance.getValueB. Yeah, so, and then once you put a couple of statements in, again, it's all about incrementally testing and running a program. I'm going to switch back to Eclipse now because I've shown you the kind of strange effect in the terminal. I can run it here, and you can see everything so far as expected, right? So I'm starting in main, this is where I expect to start. I've created values in the pair, 0 and 10, that's all fine, that's what I expect. Yeah. So then I can come after here and I can say system.out.println balance, pair balancer created. Now really, if this was more of a software engineering focused module, which we kind of touch on, but really focus on the languages themselves or programming itself, then really we'd be using more advanced debugging tools here to step through our code. But given that this isn't on the syllabus really for PPA, we're going to do this manually. And to be honest, because our programs are reasonably small, it's I think a reasonable way to understand how things are going on, or what's going on. Okay. So this is fine. Again, I've tested it. Pair balancer created. I know I'm getting to that place fine in my program. Let's now put a print line here and say pair balanced, like this. Okay. Right, so I run it. Ooh, no pair balanced. It just kind of arrived later on. Did you see that? So there was a delay here, there was a wait. So something strange is going on, because this maybe suggests that there's a large amount of computation going on, but that's really not quite right, given that it only really needs to increase and decrease these values by a very small amount. Yeah, so I have my laptop is only a year old, so it shouldn't really be struggling with very, very trivial computation here. So it's strange that there was this delay, right? So in some cases as well, in your own assignments, again, as I said, with the idea of the flights, you might never see printout, right? You might have written a print statement somewhere, and it might never arrive because you're stuck in some kind of loop. So I'm thinking to myself here, there's some problem here, because look, waiting, and then it arrives. It's a bit strange that there's something going on here. There's some problem. So now I've narrowed down where the problem will be. Okay, so with my print statements, I've narrowed down where the problem will be. I know it's something to do with calling balance pair. And you can do the same logic in your own program. You can follow through with print statements to work out where these problems might be. So yeah, again, as I say, if you had some print statements later on in your program for your flights, work out where they stop. When they stop arriving, or when they're late to arrive, that means you're in some kind of strange loop that might need working out, might need solving. So I can go to my pair balancer. I can say, so now I'm going to have jumped to here. So I'll say system.out.println preparing to balance pair. Okay. I can run it again. I can say, oh, it gets to preparing balance pair straight away, and then, oh, and it pauses here again. Yeah, we get this weird preparing to balance pair. See what I mean? So there's something strange going on here. Something that I know is a bit off. Okay. And actually, what I'd say is something that you can do if you start getting, it's actually a great thing to show. So I got this strange, again, preparing to balance pair, not quite sure what's going on there. And you might suspect that this is coming from extra code that's maybe kind of clouding your understanding of your debugging process. So you can actually feel free to comment later parts of your program out. And I'd actually advise that once you've identified where the issue is, so I know it's inside balance pair, you comment everything else out afterwards. Because if other stuff's happening here, maybe in this case it reaches to here and gives me a little bit of clouded output there, then we don't really want that to interrupt what we're doing. Okay, so try and, in this debugging process, try and comment out bits of your program that you think might be affecting the intelligibility of the print statements that you have. Alright, so I can see here again, we say preparing to balance pair, so it gets here straight away, so I know the problem doesn't occur before this line, which would make sense because there's nothing before that line, just a call to balance pair. So I know I've narrowed it down now to be something in this loop. Okay, so I can confirm that to myself by saying something like here, end of loop, okay, and then run it. Oh, no end of loop. It comes later. Okay, so there's something strange there. I know the issue is now in my loop. So a good thing to do with while loops, especially if they're not working out exactly as you want them to, is to look at the conditions that you're manipulating. So I would suggest that if you have a while loop that isn't quite working as you like, as you want, that you put a print statement at the top of this while loop to print out exactly what the values that you want are. That was terribly phrased. The values that you want to use to control the flow of your while loop, print them out at the top of the while loop so you can see how they may or may not be behaving as you want them to behave, okay? Because these values and what's inside them are very important to us, because if they don't do what we want them to do, if they don't converge, then this loop will never end, or it will at least delay our program and then end in a strange way. Alright, so I would suggest that in your while loops or any loops that you think might be infinite loops, you print relevant variables that are associated with the termination of this loop, so in this case the values in A and B inside this toBalance field. I would suggest that you print these out and see what happens. Okay, so let's see what happens now. So I want to see how these values change, what's wrong with them, what's going on in my code. Run. Whoa. Okay, something not good here, right? So you see, going on and on and on and on and on. And I guess the reason it was terminating before is at some point I'm going to overflow this integer space, right? Because remember, there's a maximum value in the integer that you can store in an integer. And I guess once this hits that maximum, again, this would just be off the top of my head, I would assume that's why we were getting this delay. Of course, once I add print statements in there, I'm actually delaying the output even more, so I get this really strange infinite looping behavior, yeah? It's not really infinite, because we've got this infinite space. We don't have infinite memory, but it feels quite infinite right now, yeah? Okay, so that's not what we want, obviously, so there's something going on here. Something wrong is happening to the manipulation of these two values, and I'm never reaching this terminating condition. So the first thing to do is, I would say, is to take your while loop out completely, because it's really hard to debug output, especially if you've got loads of nice print statements inside your loop. It's really hard to debug output that's infinite, or that looks infinite at least. So I would say to take your while loop out, and I would say actually switch to a loop where there is a more fixed number of iterations, so you can see how your code is progressing in a more manageable way. So I would actually say switch to a for loop here. A very simple for loop, standard definition, just a random kind of index variable here, or a new index variable. Maybe say do 10 iterations like this. And then what we can actually do here is we can have a controlled number of iterations. So I can actually now closely examine what's going on in A and B without having this kind of scary, infinite repeating output. Okay, so I can run this again. And you can see now my program terminates straight away, everything's okay. And now I can see inside my loop here, I can look a bit more closely at the values that I have. So I can see in the first iteration of the loop, so remember I switched to a for loop because it was more manageable than in this infinite while loop. I'll go back to my while loop eventually, but only once I've solved this issue. So I can see that I start at 0 and 10. This is right, so I put 0 and 10 in, so I'm right in the first place. Yeah. Then I can see that A is actually goes downwards, which isn't really what I want. I want the lower value to go up. And I can see that that B goes up, which isn't really right. It's the higher value I wanted to go down, right? So and again, I can confirm this behavior by looking at the other iterations. So it goes down to 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. So I can see A is going, or the first value in the pair, when I'm trying to balance. Remember, I'm trying to bring them together by incrementing the first, decrementing the second. I can see that's going up, down, and I can see that the second value is going up. This isn't really what I want. Okay, so I can confirm this now in a controlled way using these print statements. So important to use these print statements, really for you as well to understand exactly what's going on inside your code. Never let the execution order of your program be a mystery. I personally don't like it, maybe because I'm a bit pedantic. I want to know exactly what's going on in there, except of course in complex simulations where it's really quite hard to know. But for these basic kind of, or reasonably basic programs, it's always good to know exactly what's going on. So always put these print statements in. But of course, don't submit them. So this is a point that I made. Don't submit these print statements. They're just for your own use to understand what's going on. So here, of course, you can probably see this is only really a contrived example. So it's a very trivial issue. I've messed up my minus and plus here, of course, on purpose. So this was giving me unexpected behavior, right? But again, this is something I've seen in solutions. People have this mixed little things up. Maybe they would have put get value A here rather than get value B. Just really check every single line. Make sure, especially in these more complex loops, these more complex conditions, that you've really got the right method calls here. So I switched these around. I had minus before, did not yet, so I want this to be plus and minus. And I think this is a fix. Yeah, but I'm not going to now delete all my print statements, put my while loop back in, just go back to everything. I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to test the fix very carefully first to make sure it is the fix. Okay, so I'm going to run my program again. What can I see here? Okay, I can actually see that this is now behaving in much more of the manner that I expect. So I say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's fine. I say 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. So these are now 5 and 5. So that means at some point this loop will be violated, this condition will be violated. So remember, this loop only keeps going while the value in A is not equal to the value in B. So while 0 and 10 are not equivalent. So I can see here from my for loop that these do match. Okay, so obviously my for loop continues because the for loop's not predicated on the same condition. But I can now see manually that there's definitely a point at which my loop will finish if it's predicated on these two conditions. So I'm happy now that this is now working as intended. So I can take this for loop out. Thank you, Mr. For Loop, very helpful. Mr. For Loop. Now I can run my program again. And I know I'm more confident now that I'm not going to get this strange behavior. I'm more confident it's going to work properly. Okay, which it does, which is great. Okay. So I can see here, remember I only print at the top of the loop, so I will never see, it will only keep looping, yeah, while it's the case that that these values aren't the same. So once these become 5 and 5 in here, I'm never going to see the last result, am I? So I could actually put one more down here. Yeah. So obviously, remember, look at that. If you're not sure what that means, why I'm not seeing 5 and 5 already, reconfirm the way that a while loop works. Because this condition is violated, as soon as this turns to 5 and 5, I end the loop. Obviously, this isn't true, so I get this extra behavior here. Okay, so if we run this now, then we can see here we get this 5 and 5, right? Good. So fixed. Okay, so I can see that I do get this balanced pair. Yeah, I can confirm this. Everything looks nice. And to confirm this, I can add some extra information. So I'm going to take out these print statements. Remember, I wouldn't submit these. These are just to help you understand what's going on in your code. But instead, we could add a little something to our driver. Again, I can take the print statements out here, take the print statements out here, take this print statement out here, and out of here. So I could now say system.out.println toBalance.getValueA, and then toBalance.getValueB. Yeah, I can run this now and see 5 and 5. Okay, so I can see I've gone from 0 and 10. I can see that I've balanced my pair. Make sense? Good. All right. Okay. Now I want to do this process again. So I want to balance this pair once here, and I want to balance it again. Okay, so this is the last kind of issue that I want to look at, the last kind of thing I want to do. So here what I've got is I've declared a pair object. I'm passing it to my balancer. I've balanced it here, and then I'm going to take the same object again, which contains 0 and 10, or at least I think it contains 0 and 10. And I'm going to pass it to my balancer here and balance it again in this way. All right. So to show what's going on here, let's add this little extra bit of output. Again, just for our own use to see what's happening. Okay. So I'm going to say preparing to balance pair, which means, and I'm only going to say this when I'm inside the balance pair method, okay? So I know that I'm calling a new balance pair method. And I'm going to say to balance dot get value A and then to balance dot get value B. Yeah. And then I could maybe say system.out.println balancing process. Yeah, I could say, and of course I could have done this before if I wanted to see the final output. Obviously, just do it after the balancer. So it's good that I'm showing you this, and I could say to balance. I'm gonna write banana then for some reason. What's going on? I must be hungry. To balance dot get value A to balance dot get value B. Yeah. So I can now look at this balancing process. So let's again comment this out. I could say final result of balancing. And this isn't a bank account balance. It's balancing pairs. So they're the same. Let's see what goes on here. So preparing to balance 0 and 10. So increase to 1 and down to 9. It's actually better to have the printout at the end here, I think. More intelligible. And then you can see how the values change and converge. So final result of balancing 5, 5. Yeah? Nice. So let's try and balance the pair again. Let's see what happens here if I've taken this pair to balance and I passed it once to balance A, and I passed it once to my balancer A, sorry, and I'm going to pass it again to balancer B. Yeah, so just to make this clear, crystal clear, I'm going to say system.out.println prepping balancer A. Yeah, here I'm going to say prepping balancer B. I'll run this, and we're going to see the results of balancing these pairs in 2 goes. Okay. Wow, what's going on here? You see, something strange indeed. So I've taken, well, shouldn't be strange really, but that's kind of the point of this looking at this issue. So we're taking 0 and 10. Yeah, we're passing it to balancer A, and it does the balancing. And we're taking 0 and 10 again, and what it appears that we're doing is passing it to balancer B as 0 and 10 and then balancing it again. But balancer B is telling us that when it's preparing to balance A and B, the values that it has are already 5 and 5. See what's going on here? So I pass 0 and 10 through here, so 0 and 10 here, preparing to balance, does the process fine. And then what it looks like is we're taking 0 and 10 again, passing it to balancer B, but balancer B is saying, well, this is already balanced, all right? So this may seem strange, right? Because I take balance here, this 2 balance pair here, pass it to the balancer, and then take it again and pass it there. This might seem strange, especially if you've looked at Java being passed by value, passed by value instead of passed by reference. So you'll have seen this idea in the notes that if we pass a variable to a method and manipulate that variable, then the original value is not changed. But remember, there was this subtle idea that the notion is different for objects. So if I pass an object to a method, and or in another class, or in the same class, and manipulate the values in that object in some way, and then take that, so for example, to balance is a pair, I pass it to the balance pair method, I pass it to balance A, store it inside balance A, and then manipulate it inside balancer A. Yeah, so if I take one object and pass it to a class here, then if I take that same object and pass it somewhere else, so here to balancer B, so now you can see 2 balances stored inside balancer A and balancer B, the rule is a bit different than it would be for primitive values. So if I had any updates I make to 2 balance, this 2 balance object inside balancer A will also affect the stored object inside balancer B. Yeah, so this was a subtle point made in the notes that the rules here are different for objects, and we've actually seen this idea already during the lectures. So we saw this automatic book reader. I had my main method, my book reader. I created an object of automatic book reader. I passed my book to this automatic book reader. It increased some pages. And then I went back to my book reader in my main method, and I printed out what page I was on. And I could see that the result of passing my book to that automatic book reader was retained. So you could think about it as having one copy of the object where it originates from inside the main method of the book reader. Then you would pass that object to automatic book reader, so it's got its own copy to work with. But they're linked in some way, all right? So Again, I would love to be able to talk to you about the reasons behind this, but because we're just trying to keep things as simple as possible, why this is won't become clear, I think, until the first lecture of next semester. So next semester, you'll see exactly why this is. But at the moment, it's sufficient for you to know that Java is pass by value in terms of primitive types. But if you pass objects instead, then things get different. Things are different. Okay, so if you pass objects, then any changes you make to that object within a method will affect that original object. So here the point is that if I balance the pair once, relating to this single to balance object, I then can't balance it again because this 0 and 10 was changed to 5 and 5 in the first balancer by the first balancer. So the second balancer has no work to do because the copy that it has is the same as the one held by balancer A. So balancer B and balancer A share the same copy of 2balance. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, watch again or ask me. But the way to solve this is to have another copy. So we could have 2balance. And we could call it, again, equals new pair, 0, 10. So that's the way we would solve this. We'd need another object that, of course, these are now separate objects. So if I pass this to balancer B, then they're not going to interfere with each other. They're separate objects. So if I run my program now, you see both are balanced. So it prepares exactly the same behavior now, which is what we were hoping to have before, but didn't have. We balance pair A and balance pair B. So there's a couple of things here that I showed you. So I showed you this. The last thing I showed you this notion of objects being linked. I showed you this idea of getting these infinite loops or semi-infinite loops that semi-infinite, as if you can have gradations of infinity, that or at least appear not to end. And the way to solve it is to put these print statements in to understand what the values are that are stored. To change the while loop to a for loop just so you can look at a controlled number of iterations and to really for yourselves work out what these problems are. Okay, so I'm going to be a little harsher, I think, in terms of helping people out with runtime errors because I really want you to get into this habit just for your own development as a programmer of writing these print statements in, learning how to manually or automatically, if you want to use advanced tools, of how to step through your code, understand what's going on, and work out these errors. So we looked at sharing objects, we looked at these infinite loops, we looked at this idea of not trying to reference non-existent objects. So if there's no copy of a class in a field, it's just an empty field. Or sort of empty under our understanding at least, that's waiting for something to be stored there. So don't try and do that. And then again, right at the beginning, we looked at this idea of having intelligible variable names. Hopefully that's helpful. As always, I'll be here from now, or from whenever you're watching this, right up until the submission deadline.